In this talk, we will learn about reptiles, birds, and mammals, all of which are vertebrates that are amniotes. Vertebrates are organisms that belong to the domain Eukarya and the kingdom of Animalia. They are bilaterally symmetric organisms that are multicellular. All cells are eukaryotic, and these organisms are heterotrophs that have a vertebral column. Since all vertebrates show bilateral symmetry, they are grouped under the clade of Bilatria. Bilatrians can be divided into three clades, which are Lophotrochozoa, Ecdysozoa, and Deuterostomia. Out of these three clades, Deuterostomia is the clade that includes all vertebrates, including some invertebrates. The vertebrates in turn belong to the clade Chordata that comes under the clade of Deuterostomia. All chordates show four features at least some stage of their life. These include the presence of a hollow nerve cord that is formed early during development, as well as a notochord, which is a thin rod of tissues that is formed before the nerve cord forms. In some cases, the notochord may be replaced by the vertebral column as development proceeds. Chordates also show the presence of pharyngeal slits that can also be called as pharyngeal pouches or clefts, and these are present in all vertebrate embryos. Chordates also show the presence of a post-anal tail. There are three main subphyla or clades in chordates, which include the Urochordata, Cephalochordata, and Vertebrata. All organisms that belong to Cephalochordata or Urochordata are invertebrates. However, most chordates are actually vertebrates. Vertebrates are those chordates that have a backbone or a vertebral column. This vertebral column is usually made up of vertebrae. The main function of the vertebral column is to protect the spinal cord, which is a part of the nervous system. Vertebrates form their own group of animals and are not included in invertebrates. By performing molecular analyses, scientists have been able to group vertebrates into different clades. Now, all vertebrates show the presence of vertebrae, and hence any organism that has vertebrae can be grouped into two different clades. The first clade, which includes the earliest vertebrates, is called as cyclostomes. These are vertebrates that don't have a jaw, and some fish are grouped into this clade. The other clade are vertebrates that have a jaw. These include fish and all the other vertebrates, which include amphibians, birds, reptiles, and mammals. The first vertebrates that evolved were fish, followed by amphibians. Both fish and amphibians are anamniotes because they lay their eggs in water when external fertilization has to happen. These eggs do not have an amnion, and hence there is no fluid-filled cavity in which the embryo can reside while it develops. Hence, if these fertilized eggs are laid on land, then the embryo will die out because it undergoes desiccation. If we look at how fish evolved, they arose from these invertebrate animals called as lancelets, which are blade-like marine animals. The lancelets were able to give rise to the earliest fish that did not have a jaw, and hence are called as cyclostomes. Most of these kinds of fish have become extinct today, but we do have two surviving species, which are the hagfish and the lampreys. The cyclostomes evolved to form a jaw that gave rise to the gnathostomes. The first gnathostomes, or jawed vertebrates, were fish. Some of the earliest fish that were gnathostomes calcified their cartilage, which made it stronger, and hence the group of chondrichthyes came about. Sharks are the living animals that belong to the group of chondrichthyes. Some gnathostome fish ossified their endoskeleton to form bone, and thus the osteichthyes, or bony fish, evolved. A group of bony fish, called as the lobe-finned fish, evolved their pectoral and pelvic fins to form limb-like structures, giving rise to tetrapods. These tetrapods underwent more changes to ultimately give rise to amphibians, which now had the ability to live on land. Thus, we are able to see the evolution of fish and amphibians, both of which are anamniotes because when they do lay their eggs externally, it has to be laid in water. The amphibian eggs evolved over time to form a fluid-filled sac called as the amniotic cavity. The amniotic cavity had an amnion, or membranes, that made this fluid-filled sac where the embryo would reside in. Thus, the eggs can now be laid on land because the embryo was surrounded by fluid and hence could not dry out or undergo desiccation. Such eggs, where there is an amniotic cavity, is called as an amniotic egg. More membranes were present on these eggs, and hence the other parts include the allantois, which is the region where excretory waste products of the embryo are collected. Amniotic eggs also have a yolk sac, where there is yolk that provides nutrition to the developing embryo. There are also membranes that form the chorion, which is the outermost layer that promotes gas exchange. And in the case of some amniotic eggs, there can be a hard shell that provides a protective covering to the developing embryo. The clade of Amniota includes all organisms whose eggs have an amniotic cavity. The ancestral amniote that formed from amphibians diverged with time into two main groups. Sauropsida, or the sauropsids, are animals that evolved to ultimately give rise to reptiles and birds. The second group of synapsida also evolved to give rise to different types of organisms, but the only ones that are present today are mammals. Thus, the clade of Amniota includes reptiles, birds, and mammals. Let us look how reptiles evolved. For that, we need to focus on the sauropsids. The organisms that belong to this group diverged to form two groups, Diapsida and Anapsida. To look at the differences between these two groups, we need to focus on the skull of the organism. In the case of anapsids, there were no larger openings other than the one that was where the eye was present. However, in the case of diapsids, they had two extra openings in addition to the large opening where the eye was present. These two openings were used to form places where the jaw muscles could bind and thereby stabilize the muscles present in the skull. Millions of years ago, there were many anapsids that were present. However, they have all become extinct and hence there are no anapsids present today. On the other hand, diapsids underwent adaptive radiation and evolved to form the different types of reptiles and birds that are present today. Let us first look at the reptiles, which belong to the class Reptilia, which is a paraphyletic clade. This is because it does not include birds, even though they evolved from the same ancestor. Reptiles were more terrestrial than amphibians and hence underwent adaptive radiation because they had more ecological niches available to them. They became the dominant animals on Earth after the amphibians due to this rapid adaptive radiation. However, most reptiles became extinct in the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction. Let us look at some features of reptiles. Their eggs are amniotic because they have an amniotic cavity, and the reptilian eggs tend to be watertight due to the presence of a hard shell as the outermost covering. Reptiles show internal fertilization, and the fertilization between the egg and the sperm occurs before any extra embryonic membranes are formed. Thus, the chorion, amnion, as well as allantois form only after fertilization occurs within the organism. The circulatory system of reptiles also got modified compared to amphibians to enable better circulation. A septum or a wall started forming in one of the chambers. Even though the septum was not complete and hence it's only partial, it was still enough to give better circulation. Compared to amphibians, the skin of reptiles became drier and hence cutaneous respiration could no longer occur. However, this dry skin which covered the body prevents water loss and hence the reptiles no longer have to be near water all the time. Reptiles show thoracic breathing, which increased their lung capacity, and hence they're able to have better gas exchange. Reptiles, like amphibians, do show ectothermy, in which they're unable to maintain their internal body temperature when there are changes happening in the environment, and hence they obtain heat from external sources like sunlight. Millions of years ago, till the Cretaceous period, reptiles dominated the Earth. However, most became extinct during the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction, where an asteroid hit the Earth and caused many changes related to the climate and the atmosphere. However, today there are 4 surviving orders, which include the turtles and tortoises that come under the order of Chelonia. We also have the Rhynchocephalia, which includes the Tuatara. These reptiles are found only in New Zealand. Another order of reptiles are the Squamata, which include the lizards and snakes. It should be noted that snakes don't have limbs. However, they are still considered as tetrapods because their ancestors did have limbs, and with time, the snakes lost their limbs. The last surviving order is Crocodilia, which includes crocodiles and alligators. Let us now see how birds evolved. We already talked about the sauropsids and how they diverged to give rise to the diapsids. The diapsids in turn diverged to form the archosaurs and the lepidosaurs. The archosaurs gave rise to the dinosaurs, and among the dinosaurs, some of them evolved to give rise to the saurischians. Some of the saurischians gave rise to theropods, and these theropods were the ancestors of the modern-day birds. Thus, we can say that birds actually evolved from reptiles. The oldest known bird, based on the fossil record, is the Archaeopteryx. It shows both reptilian characteristics as well as bird-like characteristics. It shows feathers that are normally seen in birds and not in reptiles, but it does have a tail that is seen in reptiles but not in birds. Whether the Archaeopteryx is a bird or not depends on which paleontologist you talk to. However, there is no doubt that this organism definitely showed bird-like as well as reptilian characteristics. Birds belong to the class of aves, and they are the most diverse of all terrestrial vertebrates. All birds are amniotes, and they retain certain reptilian characteristics like having scales on their feet. Reptiles not only have scales on their feet, but their entire body is covered by scales. However, in the case of birds, the scales have been modified to form feathers. Now, feathers evolved before flight evolved, and many birds have the ability to fly. Hence, we cannot say that feathers evolved for the sole purpose of flying. In fact, it is thought that feathers probably evolved to help with insulation to keep the organism warm, to help in camouflage. It definitely helps with flight, but also it helps with courtship because birds are known to provide elaborate mating dances in order to attract mates. Some key features of birds include the presence of feathers, which are made up of keratin, which is a protein. Birds do not have teeth or a tail, and they lost them during evolution. Birds do have better circulation than reptiles because they have a four-chambered heart, where the septum that was partial in the case of reptiles became complete in the case of birds, thereby giving rise to the four chambers of the heart. Birds are endothermal, unlike many reptiles who are ectothermal, because birds are able to maintain their body temperature even if the temperature changes in the environment. Many birds are able to fly, and one of the adaptations is the hollowing of bones so that the skeleton is not very heavy. It should, however, be noted that the first birds that arose did not have the ability to fly. And even today, we are able to see birds that don't have the ability to fly. Birds are the most diverse terrestrial vertebrates and can be grouped into the clade of Neoornithes. The birds that survive today can be grouped further into three main clades. The first one is Paleognathae, which includes many flightless birds like the ostrich, emu, cassowary, etc. This clade is considered to include birds that were the earliest ones to evolve. The clade of Gallinaceae includes pheasants, ducks, geese, chicken, and other types of similar birds. Neoaves is the third clade of birds, which includes all the other birds that were not there in the previous two clades. Most of the birds are found in the clade of Neoaves. Now that we've looked at reptiles and birds, let us now look at the origins of mammals. Mammals evolved from synapsids. Organisms that belong to the group of Synapsida are different from those that are in Diapsida based on the skull. When we look at the skull of these two different types of organisms, in the case of synapsids, there is one larger opening in addition to the opening where the eye is present, whereas in Diapsida, there are two extra openings in addition to the one where the eye is present. The synapsids gave rise to therapsids, which were mammal-like reptiles. There were many different types of therapsids that had evolved. However, the only surviving descendants of therapsids today are the mammals. The mammals underwent adaptive radiation to increase their diversity after the fifth mass extinction, which was the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction that resulted in many reptiles becoming extinct. This opened many different ecological niches that allowed the mammals to undergo adaptive radiation. Mammals belong to the class of Mammalia. They have hair instead of scales like reptiles have or feathers like birds. The hair is a long keratin rich filament that extends from hair follicles that are present in the skin. Mammals have mammary glands that secrete milk, which is used to nourish their young once they are born. The circulation of mammals is similar to birds in that it has a four-chambered heart. Mammals are similar to birds because they are endothermal animals and hence are able to maintain a steady body temperature even when the temperature of the surroundings change. Most mammals show the presence of a placenta, which is a specialized organ that is present which allows fetal and maternal blood to come into close contact. This allows nutrients from the mother to be provided to the fetus when it is developing inside the organism. Mammals can be divided into two main groups. Prototheria are egg-laying mammals. These include the monotremes, like the duck-billed platypus, and two species of echidna. Thus, even though there were many monotremes years ago, today there aren't that many present on Earth. The second main group is Theria, and within this group there are two groups. The first being Metatheria, which includes the marsupials, and Eutheria, which includes the placental mammals. In the case of marsupials, the embryo develops within the mother's body in the organ called as the uterus. Thus, it does not develop in an egg that is laid outside of the body. The nourishment to this developing embryo is provided by the placenta. However, the infants are born very, very early in development. They're not able to survive on their own, and hence they go to a pouch that's present in the organism called as a marsupium. Within the marsupium, the young infant obtains nourishment and is able to complete its development. In contrast to marsupials, placental mammals have more complex placenta. It is made up of fetal and maternal tissues. This placenta allows the embryo to obtain more nourishment, and hence it is able to complete a lot of its embryonic development within the uterus of the mother before being born. Most mammals on Earth are placental mammals. When we look at where marsupial and placental mammals are present, marsupials are found mainly in Australia and New Zealand, whereas placental mammals are found throughout the world. A geographical barrier, namely the oceans, did not allow marsupials to migrate to other continents in the world, and hence they are found mainly in Australia and New Zealand. Even though the marsupials were geographically isolated from other continents, we are able to see similar types of animals that are marsupial versus placental. For example, the marsupial mole is similar to the placental mole. Similarly, the wombat, which is a marsupial, has a similar body structure as that of a woodchuck. And thus, these similarities occur due to the process of convergent evolution because the environmental conditions present in Australia and New Zealand were similar to other parts of the world, which drove the evolution of these animals. With this, we come to the end of our talk where we learned about different characteristics of vertebrates and the origins of anamniotes. We also learned about amniotes, which includes the origin, evolution, and characteristics of reptiles, birds, and mammals.